away we go. All right,
Away.
so I'm here with my lovely friend Ari Anderson, who's a three-time podcaster, podcast producer,
It's more like
intellectual explorer
20 something time at this point.
for producing or also hosting.
Oh, hosting. Yeah, this is you are correct, third podcast hosting, producing. Yeah, we're into the 20s or 30s at this point.
Wow. I you triggered a memory of all of the energy that has gone into my two and one unreleased podcast. And power to you.
Respect.
So I'm gonna quickly share my screen so that I can bring some context into this
Oh, there we
lovely
go.
conversation. So you and I talked about everything they know. There's so many overlaps here, so I'm gonna go over a few of them lightly. So everything they know is your third podcast.
Hmm.
You interviewed me on your first podcast, which was
Correct.
Millennials Don't Suck,
Yes.
which was awesome. I love that name still to this day. And also everything they know, just like every time I pull up the image, I'm like, it's such a, we talked about right before this, we talked about the Pope asking Catholics to give up trolling for Lent, and like this
Mhm.
image is, it's trolling, but for good purpose. So you interviewed me on the first one. We were actually introduced by David, and so David's mom Judy was in your first episode, which I listened
She
to last night.
she was. She features very prominently. Kind of. So the way that we kind of did this show was I interviewed about 25 people, and
Mm.
then we had all of the audio transcribed, and then we basically had like 400 pages of transcribed, material that we then, me and my editor, just kind of went through and actually basically edited visually and
Mm.
matched the timestamps to like the particular portions of the conversations. And that's kind of how we built the episodes. So each
Wow.
episode generally has like anywhere between 3 to 6 portions of different conversations.
Nerdy question. Did you use Otter for that?
No, we just I used Rev to transcribe everything, and if you, it's like an extra, I think 25 cents a minute if you
Mm.
get time-stamped transcriptions, and then it's just really easy
Huh.
um to basically, as long as you're like working from the original, you know, sound file,
Right.
um it's really easy for, to just go in and
Interesting.
do it.
Um, Awesome. Yeah, peering over the edge of a precipice of system conversations that we've had
Mm,
previously, so I'm gonna
yes,
skip
yes.
over that. Um, we love some systems. So tell us a little bit about everything they know. I have a synopsis here, but I'm curious to hear it from you and add notes along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea first sort of um, emanated last summer, and it kind of happened gradually. Like, okay, it's such a big issue, right? It's like big tech. Tech is like, it sort of started with, there's this general feeling that things aren't right, you know, and there's obviously a lot of different potentialities for the reasoning behind that. But the one that I wanted to particularly focus on was the degree to which, um, you know, our phones and our digital lives have invaded into have sort of, like a virus almost, taken over. And what gets me really curious is like, okay, so, you know, I know I'm addicted to using my phone. I know all my friends are addicted to using their phones. Like, what is it specifically, like, why are these things as addictive as possible? Um, uh, Sorry, just had to silence a call. Um, why are these things as addictive as possible? And what actually is the profit making incentive behind all of this, and
Yeah.
what is the mechanism by which these companies are making money from me like using my phone, you know?
And
um
that's touching on that for a second. That's something that we talked about a lot because of the stuff that we're doing with the cooperative, which I'll just touch on that lightly.
mhm,
That John and I, so John was CFO of Second Life, and so he's been in venture for over 2 decades. He created a digital economy before, blockchain or Bitcoin, and he and a lot of other seasoned venture investors that I've met points at essentially just capitalism for
mhm,
driving these companies. It's like, well, they took on money based on we're going to grow.
right,
And that was one of the things you touched on with Judy in the first episode, is that
exactly,
growth, like we took on money and told you that we were going to grow, so we used that money to grow, and it was growth for the sake of growth. And because growth as is such an underlying energy, it's not something that you can like step fully back and see until
mhm,
really retroactively, and you're like, oh, like this is how we got here. It's really hard to see. It's easy to see now, it's hard to see in the moment. So I have a lot of conversations where it kind of just always gets back to like the motives of money. And part of the notion of the cooperative is like, okay, if we take money, then we'll be committed to these things that we think we should do now, but might be proven otherwise later. Mm, You should be there
ba-
we go.
based on the reading that I've done, Larry Page and Sergey Brin had made public statements saying that they didn't want to profit off of human behavioral data, that wasn't a stated
Mm,
goal of theirs. Um, but what it seems happened was that after the dot-com crash in I think it was 2000 or 1999, maybe 2001, honestly, um, that basically their VCs came to them and were like, you need to figure out how to make money.
yeah.
Um, and that was when the AdSense team, which was like two people in 2002, discovered that they could generate, a lot of money per user. And that was, it was, I believe that was also like that year, or maybe the following year was the last time Google filed like a public patent for what they're doing.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, it's interesting that as soon as the use the word discovered, as soon as
mhm,
it's essentially value was discovered. So it's like discovering I would say it's like discovering gold, but it's like discovering gold as a precious metal, and human behavioral data is like discovering something that doesn't have a comparable resource. Like it's not a precious, it's not even a similar precious metal that we've never seen before. It's something wholly different.
right.
Um, and you referenced Sapiens, where Yuval talks about grains, and the discovery of agriculture is very similar. Um, it is genuinely hard to comprehend because of how big it is. And actually, Judy wrote an article that I just really love. This phrase is, I think one of the quips that she said, no one should have a God's eye view. And functionally, that's what these companies have. So
Yeah,
let's talk about the intention of the podcast. Your intention is knowledge and helping people to
correct.
comprehend, and yourself and myself included.
Education. Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm going at this from the perspective of somebody who's like, I'm essentially just a curious person. I'm a curious, like my background is in foreign policy. Um, but I'm a history nerd. I'm just kind of like I read all the time. I'm just like interested in a lot of different stuff. Um, and I just don't think very many people know, including myself,
Yeah,
the degree to which our behavior is being monitored and monetized every single moment of every single day.
yeah,
Um, and I think, it's a very demoralizing, I think is the word to use, because it feels like the issue feels so asymmetric, like the power dynamics feel so skewed towards these big tech companies in terms of like, so much of what we need to do to sort of exist in the world is accessed through these platforms and through these systems. That I think it can feel incredibly demoralizing, but it doesn't mean, number one, that there aren't a lot of people who are really smart, who are thinking about this stuff, who are trying to change the dynamics. Number two, it doesn't mean that there aren't steps that we can take in the short term, from a personal level, to potentially safeguard to a certain extent against unnecessary surveillance or against unnecessary, surveillance.
Yeah, and you jumping in on that, as you
Yeah.
introduced me to, I haven't even opened it since you introduced it to me,
Oh,
but
nice. Yeah.
the what's it called? Because now I have to find it. The privacy blocking, or the privacy app,
Privacy Pro,
um,
VPN.
Privacy Pro.
It's by
Um,
Disconnect.
and it's interesting because I bring this up, especially kind of with what we're about to do. So in the last day, 99 trackers, and then in the last week, uh, in the last week, 2.7 thousand.
Yeah, in the last week for me, it's 9,000.
I delete a lot of apps.
Nice, good for you.
So for me, like, and we talked about this before, is that I have a hard switch on my router. So when I go
Nice.
to bed, I turn
Yeah.
off my Wi-Fi. When I wake up, I turn on my Wi-Fi. When I leave the house, I turn off my Wi-Fi. When I come home, I turn on my Wi-Fi. I bought it for security. That was the purchase. That, like, I was like, I don't use my Wi-Fi when I'm sleeping. I don't use my Wi-Fi when I'm away. I bought it for security. However, the moment that I bought it, it had an unintended benefit, which is that uh, I got to choose. I got to choose when that connection existed. And Judy wrote an article about authoritarian technology, and the underlying kind of call to action at
Right.
the end of that two-part series was we need to reclaim our agency. And the act of feeling like I had some little element of control was the catalyst for a lot of other control that I started taking back, including downloading this app. So I think that, especially because we're both Redditors, we both oftentimes deeply immersed. We've talked about this also. I see a lot of conversations on Reddit go the way of speculation. I mean, anywhere on the internet.
Right.
And we have to tell people the exact truth. We have to tell people like how this works. We have to tell people how bad it is. But what seems to be more productive is making space for people and helping them to reclaim their agency. Everything else happens after that. And so part of that could be educating, but that doesn't mean proving. It means making space for the conversation. And so now is the point when I'm going to jump into what we largely were jumping on this call to talk about, which is Reddit ads. So I've been running Reddit ads, as you are aware, largely through myself. It started with these, and then it went to stuff like this for Symposium. My tea robot, I've started running ads for my appliances, and all of the comments are unlocked. And basically just, I mean, this one was absolutely hilarious because someone goes, "What kind of teas do you prefer? And where do you purchase them?" And then my friend who has a tea company, because I harassed her into having a tea company, she's a friend from the gym/beach, and she made tea as a holiday gift, and I nagged her until she started a tea company because it was amazing. She got targeted with the ad and responded to this before I could.
That's so funny.
And then I'm like, I'm like, holy shit, this is amazing. And her, it's like, by the number of deliveries I've made to him, it seems like he likes these. And I'm like, yep. So it's quite comical because the internet gets really small really quickly. When I did the one promoting my dating profile, that ultimately prompted Reddit to change their terms of service, which I find comical. but I got reports back from several female friends who I was unaware that they were Redditors at the time, and they were like, "Oh, I saw your ad." I'm like,
That's funny.
so what we're gonna do more so, we've already had this one running. This is actually one of the first ones. Since making this ad for Everything They Know, I started formatting my ads a little bit differently. And the format that I've had is, because I'm advertising a whole bunch of different things, all as me, with this goal of like being the least hated advertiser, I'm not only selling one thing. So the visual branding is going to be different. And so the visual branding that I've chosen to remain consistent is this context and comments with an emoji pointing down. And then the wave emoji, which largely because Reddit doesn't really use emojis, so it is in a frame trolling. Also because Inigo Montoya's frame for soft skills is polite greeting, name given, relevant personal context, manage expectations. So that's usually the frame that I use for my ads. So this was kind of a pretty jarring poke to hit someone with. I kind of wanted to see, based on the people that we were targeting people based on the collapse communities. So basically communities that are resonant with the collapse of society. So lost generation, anti-consumption, and collapse. Thinking that this would fit in more cleanly with things that those people who had recently visited these communities would be more likely to see. To some degree correct. This was actually a Russian comment, and I was able to link it, and just I forget what that actually linked to. Oh, it was talking about like commoditizing our brains, and I linked to The Shallows.
Nice.
Great book. And I'm sad and scared, and I'm like, it's a necessary first step. Thankfully, there are more of them. If it calls to you, check out Heal Movement. Heal Movement's the subreddit started by Will Cady, the head of brand strategy at Reddit. It's making space for a more ecologically aligned human experience. So this is me trolling someone who trolled me. This conversation I genuinely was unaware of until now. That's awesome. So this is kind of the purpose of the ads, right? So we want to make space for conversation, and you can do that by doing an organic submission. We happen to be doing it with an ad. So the thing that I haven't run ads on yet, and the reason that I wanted to kind of do this with you in public, is that as mentioned previously, if you click on Ari, this is who you are and how I know you. And the how I know you, 3-time podcast producer, 3-time podcaster. Oh. I'll go back and make that pretty later. 3 times podcast producer, co-founded Millennial System, Life Rights and Everything They Know, yada, yada, yada. Introduced by David. David is awesome. I think Judy's LinkedIn David's a serial entrepreneur. I'll touch lightly on him. David's mom, how I met David was hilarious because it was, you know that story, right? Yeah, through Mark, but partially led by me fostering a puppy in social media. And then Judy.
You should change his thing to Valparaiso, not Carico Entertainment.
He's got to update me on his stuff. I basically all of these memos are updated based on conversation.
Fair.
And so it's like someone will reach out and be like, "Hey, I'm
doing this now."
Yeah, I mean that's what the sticky note wall is for. It's like it constantly moves based on conversation, like as things come up. Because I tried to do let me do everything exactly, and I went the Bandersnatch route and almost went insane. So the hard rule is I only touch things where people have asked a question or where I'm about to have a conversation. So Judy is an internet pioneer, Silicon Valley leader, technology entrepreneur, author of Closing the Innovation Gap, and CEO of JLabs since '81. Co-founded 8 technology companies, served as CTO of Cisco Systems, She served as the CTO of Cisco Systems when Cisco bought her company. So Cisco bought her company and she became the CTO. Like any one of these things is like, Judy's
I
a
know
boss, Judy's a boss, Judy's a
it's
boss.
pretty cool. She's a pretty great lady.
Has served on the boards of FedEx, Disney, Sun, Rockwell, KQED, and Medium. Again, any one of those accomplishments is extraordinary. And these are old because I haven't talked to her in a little while. Stanford the mid-70s. I'm gonna sneeze. She's working with Vince Cerf, called the fathers of Vince, who is called one of the fathers of the internet. The way that I explain Judy to people who don't know Judy is like, she's one of the 4 co-creators of TCP/IP. She was in the room when the first packets of data were sent. She was also dubbed Mother of the Cloud because she published a paper that is cited as kind of, I guess, popularizing the term the cloud. Judy has accomplished a lot. But she's also continuing to work, and she's specifically continuing to work on facilitating the change that you are highlighting with the podcast. Is that a fair connection?
I wouldn't, I mean, I don't want to speak for Judy at all. I would certainly say that this is an issue she cares deeply about, and you know, we've had a lot of conversations. One of the things that I love about some of the things that she talks about are related to sort of like this, how we've been sort of attempting to implement like a frictionless approach to life, you know, like that Silicon Valley, like the different, you know, different tools that they develop essentially are aimed at making life as frictionless as possible.
Yeah. Which I'll bring this up because she wrote the article titled Authoritarian Technology, and I think that the headline is the outcome of a concentration of power in companies like Google and Facebook who have co-opted the need for human connection and a desire for convenience in the pursuit of technological and corporate dominance.
Right. And so, you know, one of the things that she talks about is like, so maybe a little bit more friction is necessary. Maybe like, maybe we can give up, or, you know, we can give up some of the conveniences that this technology allows for. But by giving that up, maybe we are able to sort of maintain some semblance of privacy or autonomy, you know, in exchange for perhaps, you know, not having ads that are tailored to our location data, or you know, one of the things. So another woman that I interviewed for this show, who's become one of my close friends, is a woman named Kay Krasnow Waterman.
I love Kay.
And she was the person who, at the behest of the White House post 9/11, she basically was the CIO of the effort to build the government's terror database. And then she led a reorganization of intelligence gathering at the FBI. You know, one of the things that she turned me on to recently is, so you know how, so like if you go to theguardian.com, I think it's The Guardian. And there should be like, usually there's like or click on an article maybe.
I'm also on DuckDuckGo. I don't know if that's messing it up.
Oh, for sure. But, well, usually there's like a, here, let me find her message to me
Cookie
here.
policy?
Yeah. Hang on a sec here.
This is a really plain text cookie policy. I like this.
Go to camelcamel.com. That was the one she sent me.
Okay.
Yeah, see, they don't have I don't know. Your browser, I think, is good, whatever you're using.
Well, it's the DuckDuckGo plugin.
For sure. But anyway, so basically, like if I click on this on my phone,
There, the bottom. Oh,
yes. So go to manage options. Click on manage options there, and then go down. Uh, go to partners. Click on partners. So
oh,
scroll.
holy balls!
That's on most websites. And then if you click like down tab, just a random one, and you can see what they're getting access to. Precise geographic location data, just a random company, you have no idea who it is.
Wow, what is this function? This is
It's
not normal.
as a result of GDPR, I believe is why it exists.
Ah.
And they just haven't, I guess. I would imagine that it's for some legal reason they have to show that.
Hmm. Interesting. So I mean, so I'm interested to hear your perspectives on what is progress, because I know, I mean, Judy and Kay, of what I know of the work that they are presently doing, or what I've talked to them about in the past that I can hypothesize what they've done since, um, feels very fire oriented, right? It's like fighting to
Mm,
change. And we have to do that, it seems, because of how much power these authoritarian entities have amassed. What is progress in that environment?
well, I think a great example would be somebody that I believe I've introduced you to, a guy named Eric Sapp,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. He's become a citizen.
um, who, to me, that what some of the work that he's doing is an example of, people thinking really critically and interestingly about sort of, okay, this is the technology we have at our disposal. um, how can we deploy this technology in ways that aren't, um,
So
purely
using,
capitalistic and rapacious?
yeah, using bad for good.
Right. And I mean, some of the stuff that he's done, like I feature a few of the stories that he told me on the podcast, but you know in the course of attempting to get, he had a big contract to get veterans to sign up for sort of this, um, like these support groups.
Hmm.
And obviously veterans are some of the most, uh, have a propensity for paranoia,
Yeah.
and so it was really difficult to get them to, um, to sign up for these support groups. And so he had to create this really complex funnel, basically, of ads,
Warming them to trust.
bringing them to the website, and then bringing them to, these communities on Facebook, and then back to the website. And basically, he ended up figuring out a process by which, um, he was getting more signups than they knew what to do with, and they actually turned it off. But in turning it off, they figured out they after they turned the whole funnel off, they still were getting like 50 signups a week or some crazy shit. And what he surmised ultimately is that he actually, essentially, I mean, it's a much more complicated, thing that happened than this, but he basically taught the algorithms empathy. He taught them how to see where somebody is, and to be able to meet them with what they needed. And the way that he phrased it, I think, is really interesting. um, in that most, Facebook, Google, Instagram, any of these free to use platforms, ultimately, like, Like, they are going to be used by people who either want to sell you something, make you believe something, or get you to do something. And essentially what that is like, this is where I want you to go, and I'm going to create, parameters by which I'm going to get you to go there. And
Right.
what I think, what Eric talks about, and what I think ultimately is like, sort of a shorter term philosophical shift for all of this is, what do you need, and how can I provide the tools to help you get there?
Yeah.
Because
It,
ultimately, you are probably the biggest proponent, one of the biggest proponents of sort of the virtualization of life that I know of, and I think you would agree that the tools that do exist um, to augment and make better stuff that we're already doing, or things that we are, places we already want to go in terms of being able to get exposed to new ideas or new communities or new people, or whatever, or to amplify an important message is all there. It's just that the platforms themselves, because there's so much money. I mean, if you think about like Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, the country's built, or the company's built on the backs of data.
yeah.
Basically have a combined market value that's like bigger than the GDP of Europe. And like the amount of value that's been generated simply off of our behavior is something that I think that we don't, it's not that we don't have the capacity to understand, but I just think it's very difficult for most people to really wrap their heads around, because we have
There
this,
was a really good TED talk about like how we don't have the cognitive capacity to understand large numbers.
For sure, that's true. But I think even more that, like, they've been really smart about how they've used language around these products and around these platforms, and around like this idea of building community, and like it's been presented to us in a way that is very much does not elicit ideas that it's an extractive paradigm, when it is ultimately.
and
When
so I want to pause you for a second and point out that on the right side, I'm creating an ad based on data that's made available to me as an advertiser on the right side of my screen.
Right.
Behind you, behind your video, I'm watching people read my memos over here in real time. And I can see here that someone in Los Angeles is searching my library for Fullermint. They're going here. And I would surmise that based on the memo that they're going to, and based on the manner in which they got there, this is Nick, our developer, who's browsing my library for some piece of context that he's sharing with someone in this very moment. No, that's not. Someone was loading this, which is interesting. Interesting. I think that is Nick, but I'll explain why another day. So the intention, as well as how the context is communicated, is very important. And I call into mind this study that was like the majority of malpractice lawsuits would have been dropped had the patient been given an apology and an explanation of what happened. And these tech companies, they hide, right? And they hide for a number of reasons. They hide so that they can get away with things that would otherwise be, conveyed as not desired. But also, like, it's challenging to convey. It's a hard thing to explain. My mom kind of almost understands. I mean, I'm a marketer. I've explained it to my mom in every possible way that she might be able to understand because she's not in technology, how an ad shows up where she might see it.
Right.
And just for the sake of like, this is how this part of the world works, which is a large part of the world, and also, you know, a large part of my life. It's a conversation that requires an immense amount of context just to have. And you listen to the first episode with Judy, it's like, I was learning shit and I'm nerdy. And, you know, she's talking about how there's, actually, I wrote it on a sticky note, open systems innovation,
Mm.
by comparison to vertical integration, which Gene Key's fantastic book, highly recommend. So my lacrosse number in high school was 16. Um, I was meditating 24 hours before I listened to that episode, and the number 16 just popped into my head. Um, Not entirely surprising because the number 32 popped into my head like 2 days before, and it was in the middle of a conversation that was eerily resonant with the number. Like, so I was like, okay, I don't know, something in the universe, different story. Anyway, 16th Gene Key has a quote: "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not hearsay, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference." Um, I was reminded of that when I was listening to the episode, because that's a lot of what it feels like
Yeah.
Judy's talking about, is that the only way we allow them to win is by letting them.
Correct.
And so I think that, don't like, your podcast is a great frame of both education but also conversation, and that's part of the reason why all of the comments very much must be open. I mean, they all are on all the ads that I run, but we welcome people to have this conversation there. We want to make space for people to have the conversation. Comically, obviously, we're doing that with advertising. That's more my blend of humor than anything else. Um, so it's it's a I hesitate to call it a battle, um, but it's a thing that comes to light through conversation and discourse. And not to say that like we have to uprise and burn the buildings down, but we should understand what's happened. We should understand how we got here, and we should
Right.
understand the steps that we as individuals have the ability to take. And I think there's a quote from Ascent of Humanity is, the collective transformation of humanity is the summation of billions of individual transformations.
No, it's absolutely true. I think um, in a lot of ways I think like this issue is very reflective of sort of what's happened with what's happened in Western culture in the last 30 years, sort of on a higher level, in the sense that like we there was so much worry of sort of the government version of this in the early 2000s, specifically post 9/11, funnily enough, with the very database that Kay was working on, um, uh, in terms of, warrantless wiretapping and that sort of thing. And I think, you know, um, what happened was that Google and Facebook and Amazon, I don't put Apple in this box just as much, because they don't make their money on data. They make their money on selling products and services. And so it's just the model is different, in terms of how they're generating money. Um, but I think that we had such a sort of like a religious, we put these founders and these tech companies sort of in a similar light as to how I think that, like, if this was 500 years ago, we would have put priests or prophets, in the sense that, like, as religion and faith have disappeared, you know, for most of us, I think, in terms of, um, you know, having that be a central sort of pillar of our lives, we replaced it like with this, you know, sort of this faith that this technology would bring about some sort of utopian ideal future. Um, you know, and that goes down to that's why the title of the first episode is "Don't Be Evil." That used to be Google's slogan, you know.
Used to be is an important
Right. I mean, they
phrase
changed
to
it.
highlight.
Right. But that's reflective of the fact that like even they couldn't take that seriously anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
it's you know, we were so caught up in what this technology allowed for, and what it how it allowed for us to change our lives, and how it allowed for, you know, you and I really like the jobs that you and I do wouldn't exist without these technologies, you know. Like we would be doing, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's like, it's not that they're necessarily bad, it's and I think, you know, sort of the big question is like, is it possible to just, um you know, put the genie back in a little bit? Like, is it possible to, like Junie says, like to just to add in a little friction again? um and I'm actually, you know, it's funny, I went into the production of this like sort of the big end of the summer, like as as I was sort of in the research phase and reading a lot of books, doing a lot of research, and just feeling super fucking morose and depressed about like, um the state of the world, and just how like, yeah, there's no coming back, like the, you know, the the level of asymmetry, even just in our understanding, in the understanding of our politicians to create meaningful, you know, sort of legislative parameters around this stuff. But as I've, you know, I've had conversations with 25 of the most, you know, intelligent, competent, impactful people in this world, whether it's, you know, people like Judy and Kay, data scientists, uh, you know, policymakers, you know, high level government officials, current government officials, um, you know, best-selling authors, you know, in various different realms of this arena. I interviewed Obama's chief technology officer,
Mm.
um, and I actually ended up feeling, and I do feel significantly more optimistic about the future, simply because I think that, you know, I was talking to uh, this guy Brian Lane, who's the his official title is like head of data and artificial intelligence for the government, the GSA, the Government Services Administration, which is sort of like basically the GSA. The way that I understand it, it's like the government's in-house consulting arm. So they the GSA helps streamline other bureaucracies, which is hilarious. But what he was saying is that he, you know, part of the reason why these, um, you know, why Facebook was such an ideal tool for manipulation in the 2016 election is because, um, users were relatively, um, unsophisticated when it comes to, you know, understanding what's real and what's not. And even in the time since then, um, there's there's been enough conversation around, and there's enough, there's just a, you know, a deeper understanding of what's real and what's fake, and more sort of more lights have been shown on this particular issue, that you know, this fake news stuff, and uh may never be as effective as it was in 2016, I guess is what he was saying. And obviously, the technology will evolve as well, like, what we see with stuff like deep fakes, but still, even just that point was one that I hadn't considered, and I guess just made me think sort of in the context of this larger conversation of like, maybe it's not as truly, dystopian as sort of
I think
initially thought.
Reflecting that back to you, the feeling of dystopia seems to stem from a feeling of helplessness.
Yes.
And in the process of doing research for a show that is intended to educate people about what's happening, you felt a greater sense of ease because you started to understand more deeply what was happening. And
yes, that's true.
so and that's one of the comments that we pointed out earlier, is that I'm sad and scared. It's a necessary first step.
Right.
In order to
It's true.
move away from where we are, we must go through a very uncomfortable process of deconveniencing our lives, and moving into a space that we don't know. Actually, the homepage of One Inc. is the purpose is to return humanity to an original psychology of abundance at a higher order of complexity. And that comes from the ascent of humanity, and specifically, not that I have a shortcut to search the book, but I do. So he talks about the 4 stages of the Gaian birthing process. And he talks about how in the birthing process, I'm gonna go back up, the perennial matrix of like the baby is gestating in the mother, and it gets to a point where the environment starts to constrict around it, and it can fight against that environment and say, no, I want to stay here, this is comfortable, this is what I know. And it can fight and fight and fight, but at a certain point the environment's going to have its way and force the baby out. That's what is necessary for the birth. And he talks about the Gaian birthing process as, and there's this quip that I really love, is that when a baby is born, it emerges into a world it emerges into a reality it could not have previously imagined. And then it reunites with the mother in a different relationship, and as a separate entity, not a part of the same entity. And so that phrase has really stuck with me since I read the book, is it emerges into a reality that we could not previously have imagined. So acknowledging the discomfort, and so too acknowledging we don't know what's next, but the only way we get there is by acknowledging that we don't know it and going through the discomfort of birth.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll see, I might be in the following chapter. Yeah, this is a great book, by the way. Dense, intense, highly academic, but kind of a remnant of Sapiens, Charles Eisenstein.
Oh, for sure.
He wrote Sacred Economics as well. So in the interest of time, where are we? We're at about an hour. So bringing you back into the facilitation of conversation. So what I've done here, just to run through one of these, is that the way that Reddit's ad system works is very basic by comparison to what Facebook's does. And what you have the ability to target with Facebook is a sliver of what they have. And Reddit is the same thing, but for the systems that they have to create to allow advertisers to target based on the data take longer than it does to collect the data. And so larger corporations with larger budgets can say, hey, we want to be able to do this specific thing. Platforms will say, cool, we're going to build that feature for you manually, in the same way that a lot of the stuff that we do for the first, second, and 10th customers that we bring in for a thing we make it's manual. And then if we get enough customers, then we build the platform. So what I explain to people a lot is that I can target anyone who's male on Facebook. That was like a really early thing. Prior to
So like,
2016,
I thought you said Reddit, and I was about to make a joke.
oh no, no. I feel like I know what that joke would have been, but so with Reddit, they don't know your gender data, because there's nowhere in Reddit where you say I am male in a field, but you might say that by using a pronoun such as like, he, in conversation. And they absolutely do have the ability to, we'll say, run a program to say which users have said as a protagonist, declaring themselves as male. So they have the ability to do that. I, as an advertiser, not in their, we'll call it, corporate classification, do not have that ability. If I had a budget of, let's say $250,000 a month, they might give it to me. So Reddit is functionally adolescent by comparison to Facebook, but both platforms only provide a sliver of what they have. And what I found is a really interesting frame, not even specifically regarding everything they know, is every ad that I've been doing, I've A, been leaving the comments open for discussion. B, I've been sticking a comment at the top with contextual augmentation into Mythos with like context of how I know you, context of like why we're promoting ETK, because you're a citizen of one, one being citizen, which actually we're just filing our articles of incorporation. I'm literally signing these and overnighting them to John to sign. Sidebar, there was a legislation in 2015 that the state of California created a worker member cooperative format. So it's mandated in the articles of incorporation that 51% of the company must be owned by the members, and up to 49% can be owned by outside investors, but the outside investors only get one share, just as all the members do. So you joined Citizens before this existed. You joined Citizens when it was a community of people with like minds. This is the real world legal filing to intend to build technology that maintains this intention of doing good in the world. So this is intended to prevent the outside capital coming in and driving us to a place where we're, I pulled it up earlier, but the human use of human beings. John and I have been talking about like, what's the legal structure that helps us to maintain that over time, and talking about time as 10 and 50 and 100 years, and create a living system. So part of that in the present is doing an ad, leaving the comments open, so allow people to have a voice. That's important. To give people context. So here's who I am. Here's how I know Ari. Here's how the Everything They Know podcast came into being, which, that memo will be bolstered by this conversation as soon as this conversation is concluded. But also, you're seeing this ad because. So I tell people how they're being targeted. That's not something I've ever seen anyone do, except satirically when I was like doing my Stoned and Single thing, which that's how it came about, was doing it as a joke first and then seeing how that happens. So sharing that with people is something that I've been doing. It's quite comical to me that I'm able to do it with you in this frame, because I've been doing it kind of as like a troll of like, let me tell you how advertising works through advertising. But then
this is a very meta way of doing this.
And then, Will Cady, who's the head of brand strategy at Reddit, created Heal Movement, which is a subreddit that he asked citizens to contribute to. And now I'm going to start running ads for it because it's something that I personally believe in, and it's something that's resonant with the community. It's community focused on a more ecologically aligned human experience on this planet through the apparent systematic collapse of the 2020s. This is a very different frame of what the purpose of what Everything They Know is. Everything They Know is about educating people about what's happening. This is about centralizing people in a space where we can do something about it. And so same resonant frame, very different place in that conversation. And I am grateful to have the ability to tell both these stories at the same time. what I pulled up here, kind of coming back into it, is that, okay, so in the way that you create a Reddit ad is quite simple: title, link, display URL. So the display URL is going to be this little thing right here. You can choose whether or not to lock or allow the comments. By default, they are locked. I personally always unlock my comments. Calls to action can be like a button, like sign up now. So this minus the image is what the ad will look like. I wrote here a few different ways of framing it. I am a bit nutty about creating succinct copy, particularly when it comes to advertising. So I will continue to iterate on this after this call, when I can think more clearly after I've peed the entirety of the coffee that I drink. However, creating a very succinct, like, you don't know Judy. Actually, the Forbes feature on her was like the most influential woman in Silicon Valley that you've never heard of, which I loved. And telling that story through an ad for the purposes of then driving people to this memo that I'm creating for that particular episode of Everything They Know. And it's a bit unique when it comes to Judy, because I've met Judy. I've worked with David, her son. That's how we met. So we met, and then you interviewed me on the Millennials Don't Suck podcast. We've been friends for a few years. So there's a lot of context that is interesting to look at, because you see, like, if you just look at you, me, and Judy, aligned in belief, very different in action. Very, very different humans, but like, I think we all are like, yeah, this is a thing, and we're all doing our own version of that. So I say that as a foundation for saying, there is no prescribed next step here. The
Right.
the intention is to make space for people to find the steps that make sense for them and their journey.
Totally agree. I mean, it's funny, like it's really hard to change behavior. Even knowing this stuff, even knowing it still is really difficult to, these platforms, these technologies are designed to be addictive, and they're designed to pull you away from, pull you back into their world. And so even with, awareness and knowledge, like, you're right, how everybody takes that next step is going to be different, just because, the like you mentioned earlier, the pull towards convenience is very strong.
Yeah.
So it's a conversation that I think, but I think it's also one of those things that, once there's a critical mass of people who agree, it will be easier, just because it won't feel as sort of isolating,
Well, I mean, I've heard stories of people who have been vegan for 20 years, and specifically this one woman who I happened to start chatting with at the farmer's market, and she's like, yeah, I remember going on vacation to Louisiana 10 years ago as a vegan. Like, the only thing
Right.
that you could eat was iceberg lettuce. No matter where you go, there's no option.
Right.
And if you can, like, imagine that, which is a very tangible thing to imagine,
That's a great comparison.
it takes, I mean, like, there's Impossible Burgers that look disturbingly like meat. Like,
Yeah,
and
like
I can go grab
bread.
yeah, like, I can go grab those at Costco right now. And that was not available in the same way that, like, we didn't have wireless internet. I remember the first time I had a laptop that didn't have a LAN port. I'm like, like, I just had to buy a dongle for a LAN port so that I could live stream.
I remember, like, I specifically remember, like, oh, do you have an airport card? Like, like, I remember the Apple airport. I was like, oh, fuck. No.
I went to a high school that they gave out laptops briefly, and they had those little PCI cards with the little antennas that stick out.
Oh yeah.
And what was hilarious, and this is a total tangent, but our school was like 250 people, and it had a T1 connection. And this is back in the day before anyone thought that we should put a restriction on any one connection to the T1 connection.
That is
So
hilarious.
I waited for everybody to go to a basketball game. So the entire school was at the basketball game. And me and a friend had the entirety of a T1 connection with zero restriction, and just started. I mean, it was like you download a movie in seconds, and, you know, obviously not legally. And then now
That's
you look at like
hilarious.
what you can do with streaming from Netflix, and it's like that was a glimpse into the future.
Mhm.
And so when I walk in the door and I want to, like, I'll get home right before I have a call scheduled, I have to wait about 30 seconds for my internet to boot up so that I can take the call. And that has in many ways been inconvenient. You know, like every morning I wake up, same routine. My girlfriend now pretty much lives with me. And so I wake up, I click the Wi-Fi button, I go to the bathroom, I then walk in the kitchen, and usually I'll, like, you know, put a dish away or something. And then I start saying Alexa to see if she's awake, cancel, because she does my meditation timer, because I don't want to look at my phone. I intentionally don't look at my phone until I've meditated, brushed my teeth, taken a shower, journaled, then I look at my phone. And that's that reclaimment of agency. But I reclaim my agency through technology.
Mm.
And there's an inconvenience because a lot of mornings we're just like saying, you know, Alexa's name again and again and again to see, has she woken up yet, has she woken up yet. Sometimes we have to reboot her because she doesn't recognize the internet solely. So we like start our morning with a moment of frustration to meditate, because I don't want to, there, like, I don't have a meditation timer that doesn't have a screen. And it's
That's funny.
inconvenient. It's inconvenience.
Why don't you just get like a
And
little hourglass?
because then I don't have an auditory,
Mm.
I want a soft trigger to come out of the meditation, and I
Sure,
have yet
sure.
to. And then if I'm like, oh, buy this thing, then it's techno fundamentalism, which is new technology to solve the problems created by the last technology, which
Mhm.
functionally is my internet switch to turn off the Wi-Fi. So
Mhm.
the reason I say that is it is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I expect to experience many more discomforts like that in the process of finding or continuing to reclaim my agency in this environment. And I tell that story to make space for other people to find their own journey, and also to talk to us either in the comments of these ads in Citizens of One, through the reviews on the podcast, in any way, shape, or form. The point being that we're together on this. We collectively are the users of this technology that is taking our agency, or that we have given our agency to
Mhm.
without the knowledge that we now have. We're in it together. Everybody's journey is going to be different. And it's our duty to find our own journey and to make space for other people to experience their own.
Couldn't have said it better.
I appreciate you as a sounding board and co-creative partner. I feel like you elicit a lot of these things in many ways, and I actually listened to "Don't Be Evil" later last night than I would have other later last night than I should have.
Hmm.
So I basically went to bed almost immediately after listening to that episode. Interesting dreams.
I can
Similar
imagine.
to when I fell asleep watching a panel on physicists talking about multiverse theory, just like
Oh,
existential
fuck.
dread.
Yeah,
Um, so we're here.
we're
I
here.
feel like
Let me know what you think of episode 2. That one is, it's primarily conversations with Judy and Kay. So 2 of your
Ooh,
faves.
yeah. Amazing. I look forward to doing this. I'll start sending these to you in Slack. For those who
Great.
don't know, Citizens of One, anyone can join. When you join the Slack, there's a channel for Everything They Know, which is where we're sharing thoughts on these conversations, as well as the development of these ads, as well as like how people respond to the ads with comments and feedback. It's our space for co-creativity. So we welcome you into that conversation. And thank you, Ari, for the time and being a contributing member to the cooperative before the cooperative existed legally.
Glad to be.